Hey class, today we are going to review section 2.2, which is on factor by grouping. Today we're going to look at only factor by grouping when we are using 4 terms in a polynomial, and then later on this week we will review what to do when there are 3 terms of the trinomial. So, just a reminder, when there are multiple terms in a polynomial and they don't have a common factor between all of the terms, what we want to do is we want to look at smaller groups at a time in order to factor it. So that's what factor by grouping is. So if I look at this first example, let me zoom in a little bit. We have 4 terms here. And if I look at each term, x cubed, 3x squared, 4x, and 12, all 4 of these together don't have a common factor. These 3 all have an x I could take out, but the 12 doesn't, so I can't take an x out. I could take a 3 out of these 2, but I can't take a 3 out of the x cubed or the 4x. I could take a 4 out of these 2, but I can't take a 4 out of these 2. So there's not one thing that I can take out of all 4 terms. So when that happens, that's where we want to do factor by grouping. So what we do is we take 2 groups of 2 at a time. So I like to just put parentheses around them. So here's one group. And then we're going to look at this group. And then at each group individually, we're going to take out the common factor. So just looking at these 2, I have x cubed and then 3x squared. Again, if you want to, you can write out each part and then look and see what they share. So x cubed, I can write as x times x times x. And then 3x squared, I can write as 3 times x times x. So I can take 2 x's out of each of these terms. And if you want to skip this step, you can. But my common factor is 2x's, or x squared. So when we factor it out, remember the common factor goes out front, and then whatever was left over is going to go inside. And if I started with 2, I should end with 2 on the inside. So this one had an x left over, and this one had a 3 left over, and it was a minus, so we want to put that subtraction sign there. So now we factored the first group. Now we're going to do the same thing, but with the second group. So I have a 4 and an x here, so I can write this as 4 times x, and then I can write 12 as 4 times 3. So both of these have a 4 in common. So that's going to be our common factor that goes out front. And then whatever is left over goes on the inside. So when I took the 4 away from here, I was left with an x. When I took the 4 away from the 12, I was left with a 3. And if you look at the insides, they should match. I have an x minus 3 and an x minus 3. If they match, that means I did it right. If they don't match, I did something wrong and I need to go back and fix it. So once we get both groups factored and I see the insides match on both parts, we're now going to factor out the matching piece. They both have an x minus 3. So I'm going to bring that x minus 3 to the front, and then whatever was left over, the x squared and the 4, go inside the second group. So we get x squared and 4. And because this is a positive 4, we're going to put a plus there. So they both had an x minus 3, so we're taking that out front. That's what they share. That's your common factor in the front. And then the leftover pieces go on the inside. And you're done. So that would be your answer. So if we go back over those steps, these are the steps when you have 4 terms. You want to group into 2 groups of 2. Then in each of those 2 groups, you're going to find the greatest common factor and take it out. Then check that the insides match. So that's what we did up here. They are both an x minus 3 and an x minus 3. And then you're going to factor out that common group. So we factored out the x minus 3, the common part, and then the leftover pieces go inside the second group. So let's just look at some more examples. Here I have 4 terms again, and none of these terms share a common factor. So what we're going to do is we're going to break it into our 2 groups of 2. And then in each group, we're going to take the common factor out. So for 27, I can do that as 9 times 3. And then x cubed is x times x times x. 9, I'm just going to leave as a 9. We could do 3 times 3, but because this one already has a 9, that's what we're going to end up taking out. And then x times x for the x squared. So they both have a 9, and I can take 2 x's out since this one only has 2 x's to give. So our common factor is a 9 and 2 x's, which is 9x squared. So So that's going to go in the front. And remember, if I started with 2 things, I should end with 2 things in here. So when I took away the 9 and the 2 x's, I was left with the 3 and 1 x for this part. But then on this one, if I take the 9 and the 2 x's away, there's nothing left. What we end up doing is, you can think of this as being like times a 1. That 1's there, we just don't write it. So whenever you take everything away, we can't just leave this spot blank. We're going to put a 1 there. So we end up getting 3x squared plus 1 on the inside. So just remember, if I start with 2 terms, I need to have 2 terms inside the parentheses here as well. So we did the first group. Now let's look at the second group. We're just going to repeat the process. For 18, that's the same as 6 times 3 times x. And then because we already have a 6 here, we're just going to leave this as a 6. So our common factor is a 6. But again, if I take a 6 away from here, there's nothing left. So you can think of that as being like times a 1. So when I take this common 6 out in the front, the leftover part, I have a 3x on the first term. And because we're taking everything away here, it's like we have a 1 left over here. So we get 3x plus 1. Check your insides match. 3x plus 1, 3x plus 1. We're good. So my final answer, I'm going to take one of these out front. That's your common part that we're taking out front. And then the leftover, 9x squared, goes inside, and the 6. And this was a plus here. This is positive, so it's going to be a plus 6 here. And you are done. Okay, let's try another one. We're going to break it into 2 groups of 2 and then take the common factor out of each group. So on this one, I have a 2 and then p squared, p times p, and then 4 I can write as 2 times p. Again, if you want, you can skip this step if you can do it in your head. I'm just writing it down to make sure everyone can follow. Each of these has a 2, so we're going to take 1 2 out, and then each of them has at least 1 p. I can't take both of these because this one only has 1 to give. So our common factor is a 2 and a p from each one. So that goes out in the front, and then whatever's left over comes inside. I started with 2 things, I need to end with 2 things in here. So when I took the 2p away, I was left with 1p here. When I take a 2 and a p away from this, I'm left with 1 2. And again, it was a plus, so we bring the plus down. So we're done with that one. Let's look at this group. On this one, we have a 3 and a p. Can't really break that apart at all. But 6 I can write as 3 times 2. So we see that our common factor is just the 3. So that 3 comes out front. The leftover part, the p, and then the plus 2 come inside. And we see again, as our check, both of the insides match, p plus 2 and p plus 2. So that means we did it right. So the p plus 2 is going to come to the front. And then the leftover parts, when I take the p plus 2 away, I'm left with a 2p that goes inside and a plus 3. So again, this was a plus here, so we're bringing that plus down. And you're done. Okay. I have a couple other cases I want to look at. Sometimes you might have a greatest common factor that's equal to 1. So I want to look at a case where this happens. So again, we have 4 terms. I'm going to just start by grouping it into 2 groups of 2. And then take the common factor out. So for 6 and 3, I can write that as 3 times 2. And then we have 3 x's. And then 3 and 2 x's. So I can take a 3 from each group and 2 x's from each group. So the 3x squared, remember 2 x's is the same as x squared, comes out front. We're left with a 2 and an x on this part. But then again, when I take the 3x out here, it's like there's a 1 there. So I need to make sure to put a 1 here on the inside. If I have 2 things here, I need to have 2 things here. So we're going to use that 1 and bring it down. But then on this one, if I look at the common factor, 2 and x I can't break apart any more than they are. And I just have a 1 here. There's nothing in common. When this happens, when you don't have a common factor, it's kind of like we have a 1 times 2x here. And then 1. So really 1 is our common factor. We're going to bring the 1 out front, and I'm left with a 2x And if I take the 1 away, it's like I'm still left with a 1. So it's kind of a silly case where we're just going to have to use a 1 as our common factor because they don't share anything else in common. So whenever that happens, they don't have a common factor, we're just using a 1 as our common factor. But our insides match, 2x plus 1, 2x plus 1. So to write my final answer, we take one of those, and then the extra parts out front come inside the second group, the 3x squared plus 1. And we're done. So watch out for those ones that the common factor is a 1. And then another case I want to look at is what happens when you have a lot of negative signs. We need to be careful with that, particularly when this one is negative. So when the third term has a negative in front of it, that can be kind of hard sometimes. I see a lot of students make mistakes with this one. We're still going to put the parentheses around it, but because this is a negative instead of a plus on this third one, we want to bring that negative inside the parenthesis and think of this as a -6, not just a +6. So be careful when that third term is negative. We need to bring it inside with it. But other than that, we're just going to do the same steps. I'm going to take the common factor of these ones. You can see already there's a 4 you can take out, and then I can take out 2 n's since this one only has 2 to give up. So 4n squared is our common factor. If I take a 4 away and 2 n's away from this, well, the 4 is gone, and 2 n's from 3 is 1 left over. And if I take a 4n squared away from this, that's taking the whole thing. So again, whenever I take the whole thing, I need to put a 1 there as a placeholder. So I had 2 terms, I still need to have 2 things here. This one doesn't just go away. So we're done with that part, but here's the one that can be tricky. Again, we want to make sure we bring this negative with the 6 right here. We don't like this to be negative, because if I just take a 6 out, I'm going to be left with a negative n inside my parentheses. But this is a positive n, and we need it to match. So what we end up doing is we're actually going to use -6 as our common factor, because if I take a negative away, it's going to turn to a positive. And then, so -6, if I take the -6 out, we're left with just a positive n, which is what I need to match the n over in the other group. But then over here, if I think of this as a -6, this was initially a +6. So in order to keep my signs correct, I can think of this as being times a -1, because -6 times -1 is +6. So if I'm taking that -6 out, I'm left with a -1 on the inside. So essentially what it's doing by taking the negative out here is both of these signs switch. This became a positive, this one became a negative. But we had to do that to make both groups the same. We have an n-1 now. And if I hadn't, let's just kind of look over here. Let's just say I just took a 6 out and not the negative, I would have been left with a -n. And if I took a 6 away from here, I would have been left with a +1. But -n plus 1 won't match my n-1. So we need to bring that negative out as well so that our signs flip and it matches our first group. So that's why we do that little trick. But then once they match, we're good to go, and we just factor it like normal. We're going to take that matching n-1 out into the front, and then the leftover parts, the 4n squared minus 6, comes on the inside. And then just really quick, sometimes when you do have numbers in here that have another factor, so if we look at 4 and 6, these do have a common factor we could take out again. Sometimes we need to do that as well. If I think what number goes into 4 and what number goes into 6, they both have a 2 in common, right? So if I take a 2 out, I'm left with 2n squared from here. If I take a 2 away from 6, I'm left with a -3. So sometimes you'll be asked to factor even farther and take that 2 out as well. So that would change our answer. We'd still keep the n-1, but because this is just a 2, we'd like to write that in the front, and then we would have our 2n squared minus 3 on the back. And that would be considered fully factored. So again, kind of look out if some of your terms have a common factor in the front like that. We'll need to take that out as well. Okay, and then one more example. Again, I just wanted to do another one that had a negative in there. So we still start off the same. We're going to take two groups of 2. But because this third term has that negative on it, we want to bring that in with that group. So then of the first group, 3 and 2 don't have anything in common, but we can take 2x's out. So I'm going to take x squared away. If I take 2x's away from this, I'm left with 3 and 1x. If I take 2x's away from this guy, I'm left with a minus 2. So there's the first group. Second group, again, whenever this one's a minus, we are going to take the negative out with it. And then for 6 and 4, they both have a factor of 2 in common. I can do 2 times 3 and 2 times 2. So I'm going to take that 2 out. And again, we're taking that negative out. And what that negative, when I take it out, is going to do is it's going to keep this positive. So I get a positive 3x. But then because this was a plus 2, if I think of this as being a negative 2, this also will have to be a negative 2 in order for negative 2 times negative 2 to turn into a positive 4. So this is going to turn to a minus 2. So bringing the negative out here switches both of these signs. This becomes positive, this one becomes negative. And again, we have to do that in order to get the signs from the first group to match the signs of the second group. So keep an eye out for when this third term is negative. It's going to end up flipping all the signs in that group. But we see the 2 insides match, so we're good. So we have the 3x minus 2 comes to the front, and then these 2 terms come inside the second part. And we're done. So hopefully that was a good overview of factor by grouping when you have 4 terms. Again, just kind of keep an eye out for when that third term is a negative. We need to be careful with our signs on this part. Also, keep an eye out for if you have multiple common factors in your answer, you need to take that common factor out to fully factor it. And then you might also run into cases where your greatest common factor is just a 1. So like on this case, we just had a 1 out front that I needed to take out for my common factor. So those are kind of the special cases that we'll be looking at. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Feel free to email me, and I hope you guys are all doing well and are healthy at home. I'll see you later.